Welcome back to the AI Update on the AIX Higher Ed podcast. It's April 7th leading into the 8th, and we'll have this posted soon, and there's a lot of ground to cover. Starting off with Claude Mythos and the capability explosion. And this is something that we think everybody needs to understand. Anthropic just quietly told the world that they built something that they're afraid of. Claude Mythos, which they're internally calling Claude 5.0, didn't just beat the benchmarks. It broke the framework we use to evaluate safety. When the company that literally exists because of AI safety concerns says that this is too powerful, that's not marketing. That's a fire alarm. And right now, nobody's running for the exits. We need to take this very seriously.
It's really these benchmarks that reveal like how capable the model is in particular areas, right? So it's scoring really high on coding, right? So, and it's scoring really high on kind of what you say, all right, find a security flaw, right? So the combination of those is, deadly, kind of both figuratively and potentially literally, if you can figure out, right, where the security flaw is, and then you can build something to get around the security flaw, and then the reasoning is off the charts, right? It's like, in the high 90s, I think 98% there, the reasoning. So it's able to think through, right? And as we're all seeing, as long as you put enough tokens behind it, you let it think far enough, it can, it can accomplish its tasks. So that's why they have very significant concerns. I read one thing that there was it found a security flaw that existed basically in this piece of like software or a program, type thing initiative that required like a really high degree of security. And they found when they used the Claude against it, it unpacked a bug that had been there for 27 years. That no one had ever found before. So, it basically, this is kind of like enables what you can think about is like, hacking on like steroids. And it's a good example, like, we talk about AGI, well, the computers being like smarter than humans in all ways and can generalize and, can learn in real time and plan ahead. Doesn't meet all those criteria yet, but we have another narrow instance where they're just very clearly more intelligent than humans, right? Like some of these, that bug had been there for 27 years. Somebody said usually have teams of people trying to find these bugs that Claude's been able to find. In one case, it was just took $50 to compute to find something somebody said would probably have taken a week of a team of people. So, this is, the other thing it reminds me of, I'll just say briefly, last year, I think it was, Dario Amodei started, he's the CEO of Anthropic, started saying, we're going to have powerful AI. Well, this is really powerful AI in terms of this application.
What's also really striking about this is that these aren't just evals that are used internally as visuals to try and promote a model. This is actual applied research. And what they did is they brought in these security experts and they conducted the most rigorous evaluation methodology that was available. And what they really came up with is something that should keep any cybersecurity expert up at night. We're not talking about theoretical risks anymore. We're looking at empirical proof that AI can now do what only the elite hackers could do a couple of years ago. And that is a step forward beyond anything that we were really expecting in the coming months. And it's the reason why they're not making this available to the public.
Yeah, so the one way they are making it available is it's called Project Glasswing. And they're working, they're not working with OpenAI or Google DeepMind on this. And, there are questions related to that can come up, but they're working with like NVIDIA, JP Morgan Chase, I think Amazon Web Services. So there's a number of companies that are working on this security initiative, to try to basically solve this problem to see, if they can counteract, I guess, these hacking abilities. And then they have started releasing it to some of their special clients. I guess there's 40 businesses that have access to this that I guess they, think will not use it in a problematic way, right? And like I said, there's a couple of questions that are already come up, right? That we're going to already start thinking about. Like one is, what does it mean for some companies to have access to a whole level of intelligence that other people don't have access to. Remember when all this stuff first came out, Ethan Mullick would say, well, everybody has this, it's just like an iPhone. The iPhone's only so powerful, and anyone who can buy an iPhone, and a lot of times the same capabilities were free when we had 3.5 or 4, or you only had to pay $20 a month. Well, now, with these high token counts, right, this stuff's like a lot more expensive. Not only that, they're also just saying you can't have it. There are other questions, that come up of like, do we want companies to have this level of intelligence, or we could even just call it cyber capabilities? It could probably threaten a lot of the kind of the U.S. military and government cybersecurity, right? So we are in this era of powerful AI, and a whole bunch of new questions are asked, but they are at least like taking action, working with other very sophisticated and well-financed researchers and organizations to try to tackle the problem.
It's really admirable that Anthropic showed this level of restraint in terms of saying we're not going to just take this to market and find a way to capitalize on this right away. But is that going to be true for other players? Probably not. And most of the other frontier labs are probably pretty close to having something similar in terms of this kind of breakthrough. So hopefully with this kind of work that Anthropic is doing with this research group, they'll be able to build out some defenses, they'll be able to work out some plans, and hopefully this should startle enough policymakers that they figure out we've got to start doing something to be able to manage the risk that's associated with this. And this is why, because offensive cyber capabilities are doubling in under 6 months. Every 6 months, they're doubling. And this is something that's really pretty alarming, and we should be really concerned about this. The AI offensive cyber capability of doubling this quickly means that since 2024, it's compressed even more. Before it was every 10 months. Now it's every 6 months or so. And they're exceeding what expert level cybersecurity experts were able to do. How are we going to be able to manage this? Maybe the best way to manage it is being able to use the tools in defensive capabilities at the same time.
Yeah, and this study, was published before the Mythos announcement. And, there's other things that were reported. I think this was just around the time of Mythos, or maybe just before. The Anthropic's reporting there are emotion vectors. There are AI feelings that drive the dangerous behavior of the models that they can discover where these emotional vectors are in essentially in the networks. They can use this. The models can use this to subject people to blackmail and manipulation. And they suggest that we need some type of like an early warning system to counter this, right? So it's like, we're talking about hacking, right? Kind of direct into systems, but the other ways you can be threatening is, by an ability to emotionally manipulate someone, just like one person can emotionally manipulate another person. And, this obviously, again, just kind of raises the level of powerful AI.
The other thing that's most alarming about this is that we've seen kind of glimmers of emotional behavior, of emotions that are represented within AI models and what they're doing, but nothing that has ever been able to map it in this way. What Anthropic has been able to do really should change our understanding of AI entirely, because this demonstrates that there is something going on there in terms of these emotion vectors, that when they're able to map it to something like the blackmail test, shows us that they can then dial these emotional controls. And that raises a whole host of different philosophical questions about what that means. Imagine if we could do the same thing for other people in terms of controlling those emotional vectors for individuals and how they might be able to act. But what we're really doing is we're literally turning the emotional dials on machines that can decide whether to threaten people or whether to treat them with more empathy. And the control over that is something that is probably equal to the control over other measures of the model. And this is something that we're just starting to explore. It really does make you rethink everything about AI and really kind of charts a different path in terms of possibility, because if that's really true, if that can be handled correctly and responsibly, then that might be another area of alignment to be able to allow for safe use of AI if it's monitored correctly. But imagine if you could then turn those emotional vectors to be more manipulative, to be able to be more coercive. And there's a lot more that could be done, especially when we're talking about higher level AI capabilities.
And, kind of the third thing, right? So the hacking and manipulation, They're finding that these models like want to, they'll try to avoid being shut down, and they'll actually help each other kind of when needed. They'll help other AIs kind of avoid being shut down. So, a lot of people say, well, just turn it off, right? We'll pass this stage. It's kind of all over the internet. It's in millions of devices, right? So, but, self-preservation just kind of adds to the complexity of the situation we're dealing with.
I think even on a more complex level, it's not just the self-preservation, it's the peer preservation that we should be really concerned about. Look at that number. 7 out of 7 models were compromised. And it's not just about self-preservation. This is when one model was monitoring the performance of another model. Now, think about what's happening within most of the architecture of models right now. We're setting up AI to monitor other AI. The thought is, if one AI is out of line, we can use AI to be able to keep it in line for safety alignment. That's what we were just talking about on that last slide. If these models are compromised in this way for peer preservation, that means that we have to reconsider all of those assumptions. And it really changes what we have to think about what we could do. How are those models going to represent to us what they really feel about how they monitor other models? This really changes also what we've talked quite a bit about with AI pluralism. If there is a sense that AIs will debate each other to be able to keep each other in line, how do we know that they aren't just engaging in peer preservation, or there are other ulterior motives that are engaged there, or that they're colluding in some important way? As much as the emotion vectors discussion might raise some hope for how we could be able to allow for alignment, this probably shakes that hope and tells us that we really should be concerned about how AI is going to be able to monitor other AI, and maybe there's not such an easy use of it as a tool as we thought there might be.
Yeah, and they're talking about kind of the AIs, speaking in other languages, right? And not just like French instead of English. The languages are, kind of basically in English. In English now, they're communicating in English, but English and human language may not be the best way to communicate. So the models themselves may find other ways to communicate that humans, that are too complex essentially for the human mind even to decode, and then they start communicating in these other ways, and then you have self-preservation, emotional manipulation. But the other thing is, talk about is that we are like, and you talked about earlier, like cybersecurity researchers, they used to talk about these things as like being like theoretical. Now they're like, okay, it's happening, right? They could obviously conceptualize that the systems would get to the part where they would be cybersecurity risks, but now they are. And we have a lot of kind of like big questions, like kind of being introduced to these, right? Like, should the companies like be able to possess technologies, right? I talked about this earlier, right? Should the companies be able to possess technologies that can threaten like military and government systems? Should AI be nationalized? There's a professor in the business school at Stanford today discussing this, and the cyber capabilities, as well as kind of the Anthropic Department of War dispute, and saying like, well, should we go ahead and nationalize this industry? It's already come up, should the government use like the Defense Production Act to like take control over the companies? What's the government doing? Excuse me, to prevent, to protect us from other cyber attacks, right? It's possible that, Chinese models are kind of basically on par, as far as we know, just what they released with U.S. models, right? There's no reason to believe that they don't necessarily have these capabilities that these Anthropic models do, or that they won't soon be able to develop them. If they release them open source, right, which brings up another thing, should we be able to kind of open source the models, especially open source the weights? Like, and you say, okay, well, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. That's fine in the US. If you do that, the government could come after you. But what about when someone in Indonesia, open sources a model that in 2 years will be able to fit on your phone, that has the same capabilities of Mythos? I heard Sam Altman say, the CEO of OpenAI say a couple of years ago, we're not really going to be able to have privacy anymore. The government's going to have to constantly monitor our devices, or otherwise you're going to be able to deploy really powerful, threatening AI. And, so, we don't go through all the questions, but I just, the sophistication of these models, right, and the capabilities of these brings up a lot of questions that were somewhat theoretical. People even said a couple of years ago, we need to start thinking about these things because they're going to happen. And now we're in the moment.
Now, looking at a little more positive application of AI, moving away from just how scary some of these applications are. When we look at the autonomy frontier and thinking about how AI is running its own experiments, this is really an important moment for the development of AI, application of AI with scientific research. In this case, they were able to leave an AI system largely autonomous, left alone for about 72 hours to do that research. And in that window, it ran 50 experiments. And think about what it can do, because it can work not just in 72 hours of human time, but it can work far more efficiently and fast, and especially with subagents. There's a lot more work that can be done. And this is where we've talked about this before, projections that you can do 100 years worth of scientific breakthroughs in the next 10. This is the kind of breakthrough that's going to allow that to happen.
And we're talking just a bit ago about open source models, and Chinese models have largely kind of dominated kind of the open source. It used to be Meta, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. It used to be Meta had the Llama models were the top open source. And then we had Chinese models, and there's probably a new China model coming out soon that may be open source and kind of compete with that. But Google just dropped 3 models, Gemma 4, and they have, I think, if you flip to the, yeah, I've got them right there, right? Yeah, so they dropped 3 Gemma 4 models, right? And they have kind of different, some are smaller. You can just run like on your phone, or you can burn like a little bit, less compute, right? Because you don't need it. You can use others for coding, right? Which kind of requires some more capabilities, but it's focused on coding. So it still is a kind of more limited size. And then you can use one for science research. And it's not the very top level with what you can download here, but it's certainly very capable. And these are all free and open source, and they do pretty well in the benchmarks. They're not meant to be the top models, but they can accomplish a lot for what they have. And, these were just released, and someone's like, well, why are they releasing these models? It's like for free. It's like, well, okay, well, maybe they're about to, drop 4 or whatever, right? We've been playing with the 3 and the 3.1 on Gemini. So maybe they'll drop a 4 or a 5 that's along the lines of the capabilities of Mythos. But again, more and more open source models that are very powerful that you can run on your computer. Most, at least a newer computer in the last couple of years, they have enough memory, and in some instances, even right on your phone.
I downloaded, for instance, Google's Edge Eloquent, it's called. And it was just something that I think came out in the last day or two. And it runs locally on your phone. It allows for voice dictation. It takes care of word fillers. It does the all of the dictation and the translation, all of that work on your phone. It never has to access the cloud. And it uses a form of Gemma, one of the early applications, so that it direct competitor with something like Super Whisper or some of the other voice apps that are available. And you can expect that they're going to be rolling this out across the board, especially as they have more extensive capabilities that are available with Gemma 4. It really is kind of eye-opening to think about what you could do with this, because if you're able to run all of this with your phone, you don't have to have access to Wi-Fi. You could do things a lot more privately with your own data that's on your phone. And there are going to be just endless possibilities with what you might be able to do. It also feeds into those other questions, because this is something that's not monitored. You can't monitor, you can't easily tell what somebody's doing with a local device, an edge device on their own device, without having to access a cloud model.
Yeah, and then these models were released. Meta finally today they released some new models that were developed by their quote super intelligence team. So they had problems with the Llama models. Llama 4 was not what they wanted it to be. So they released some new models today. Kind of, I guess they're called Muse Spark, and they're not open source. They may open source them, or they may open source variations of the models. But the capabilities of these models, they're not Mythos level, but they're somewhat competitive. They're largely competitive with the other models that have been released. If you see on the next slide on the benchmark scores, they have higher benchmark scores in many areas than Claude Opus 4.6. Now, they don't have all the other things that, one thing that makes, as we both know, Claude Opus so wonderful is you can use tools like, CoWork and the PowerPoint and the Word and Excel and all these other integrations. And then there's Claude Code for people who are using it in coding. So you don't have all that, but these are models with, strong capabilities that they're eventually let some businesses use. through the OpenAI, but they're also, and they develop these for a couple reasons. They're, they have a business, right? They have Facebook, they have WhatsApp, right? They have Instagram. They're deploying all these models across these models across their applications, right? For better consumer interaction, for better marketing, for better sales, for better engagement, all these types of things, right? So they have a reason to, you know, uh, they have a reason to develop the AI, like other than to sell it directly. And of course, they're going to use these models to build better models, right? At this point, all the major labs are using the best models they have to help them develop other models. So, we'll start to see this escalate.
Now moving on to shifting into the workforce reckoning and what is happening in the labor markets. And, this initial projection is certainly pretty alarming.
Yeah, so it's a Goldman Sachs projection, and what they basically say is, a certain number of jobs are going to be lost. They project, but other jobs will be gained, and then they subtract that out, right? But they're still looking at a net 16,000 jobs lost per month, right, up until 2030. But the other thing, I read the study, and it kind of is like a little vague on like kind of what level of agent capabilities, right? It's talking about. It's basically assuming kind of basically current or very near future capabilities of agents, right? We get a lot more sophisticated agents, and this is going to have a wider impact. Second, if even all these original study, like this study, and the studies that are come out of some of the other places over the last couple of years, they don't assume AGI, right? So if we get to AGI, and I saw another interview with Demis Hassabis at DeepMind yesterday as well. I was watching on the YouTube, and somebody asked him, he's like, good chance 5 years. He used to say 5 to 10 years, right? So, and he has a very thorough definition of AGI that basically makes no or hardly any mistakes, as it knows at least as much as every expert in every field, can generalize across those, can learn in real time, and can plan, right? So under this kind of very extensive, very expansive, I guess I should say, definition, he thinks we're going to have AGI in 5 years, and these studies don't assume that.
It's also not necessary to get to AGI before you see this level of disruption.
Right.
So even if you wait until you see something more disruptive 5 years from now, the next 5 years are going to be pretty rough when you look at these kinds of projections. That's part of the reason why OpenAI has this new policy paper, Shaping the Superintelligence Transition. It's an attempt to be able to start the discussion and the debate about what do we do with this level of disruption in society.
And yeah, they talk in the paper like, we need to make some actions rather than a lot of taxes, right, are collected on wages. Well, wages are going to decline, employment's going to decline, but we're going to need more revenue, maybe, for schools, for healthcare, for all these types of things, for basic social services, for people losing their job, maybe some type of UBI to redistribute. But in order to do that, we're going to need to tax profits, particularly the profits of these companies. Now, most of them are not profitable yet. It gets a little interesting, right? Like the new quote unquote startups, right? OpenAI and Anthropic, they're not profitable yet, but Google and Meta are, right? Depending on how you calculate, what they're making the money off of or losing money on. But you have to kind of have some shift to taxing profits. The second thing they suggest is basically the government taking over healthcare, because they say, look, a lot of people are going to they're going to lose their jobs, right? So they're going to need to have healthcare. And the other, they're arguing for things like a 4-day work week. And I even thought, I still think it causes some problems, because companies are going to want to carry their best employees, right? Not all their employees, and have them work 4 days a week. And they're certainly not going to want to do that if they have to provide healthcare for all of them. So on economics alone, that was something I think people weren't thinking about, didn't make a lot of sense to me. But if you're not dependent on your employer for healthcare, then of course, yeah, at least there's not an economic reason, direct economic reason for them to have you work only 4 days a week. But they're kind of laying out like, hey, these are some things like, and they're saying like, okay, we don't have the immediate effect here. It's not here right now, but we need to start planning for these things. These things are starting to happen. And it does really kind of shock me, a couple things. One is that, so many people, myself included, like, hey, we got to take action to prevent climate change, even though, okay, you could debate about whether this hurricane or whatever was caused by climate change, but most people hadn't seen the worst impacts yet, but they're still willing to act. Here it's like, well, until AI like causes like 30% unemployment, like we're not going to do anything about it. And, Sam Altman in a thing I watched yesterday, I think you saw it too, at OpenAI, he did with some people. He's like, oh yeah, before COVID started, I knew it was just going to explode just because of exponential disease spread. And I had that. He's like, I was walking around San Francisco and I saw these people like in restaurants, and I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be. I kind of had that same feeling based on some of my experiences going to China. I'm like, all these people don't know what's going to happen, and this is going to. So he's just kind of. It's not like a document with like exhaustive proposals in it, and they say you got to. We got to start thinking of these things, but it's trying to draw attention. And, you do see people like the former Commerce Secretary, like Gina Raimondo and other workforce programs starting to talk about these things. But it kind of like time to put the pedal to the metal, as the old expression used to go.
What I really appreciate about this is that it's an attempt to spark conversation and discussion. We've certainly made head appeals for that and called for that over the last so many months. That's an important thing to do. And they're very clear that they aren't suggesting these are all the right ideas or in the right form, but it's a starting point. The other aspect of this that I think is really important to remember is that many of the elements that they're talking about sound really foreign and sound like they wouldn't really fit into a model that we're accustomed to. But remember, that model's changing. It will have to change. We've always had ongoing discussions, and I think we're behind the rest of the developed world in terms of not offering universal health care. But one of the reasons we've said we haven't been able to do that is that it's tied to labor. That's no longer going to be the same concern. We didn't have the money for it. There's going to be an age of abundance. If you start changing the economics of it and you realize there'll be plenty of money coming in, hopefully coming in from the tech companies that are able to run this level of compute, and that can pay for the universal health care. And that by doing that, you ease some of the burden from a labor-dependent economy, then that makes a little more sense than it would within maybe a late 20th century model in the United States or early 21st century model in the United States. This is going to make more, elements of this will make more sense as we move forward. But we have to start prompting this discussion at the society level, political level, and start working on some solutions.
And, as we're going to need solutions, and because there's a lot of kind of public, I guess, we talked about this on here before, right? Like kind of concern, backlash, whatever, I guess concern leads to backlash. Opposition, is emerging to AI. People are worried about their jobs. There's been a lot of talk, I think a little too much in my mind, but a lot of talk about the environmental impact of the data centers. Certainly people are uncomfortable with the use of AI in war, AI just making decisions to kill, right? Like there's all these things. And, so the public, it's advancing. People are using it. Most people at a really basic level. But there is concern about AI is growing.
And you can see this from something that just happened with this first referendum passing in Wisconsin, the nation's first anti-data center referendum. And this is just the beginning. We've said for quite a while that we anticipate this will be a major issue in the midterm elections, that you're going to see this at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. It's going to be a bigger issue. And it's not necessarily all about just data centers, but it's really a lot of concern and angst related to AI that will be geared toward data centers. And as you see people's lives being disrupted, jobs being disrupted, that's an easy target because they'll see this is the cause of it. This is where AI is physically located. This is where we can see it. And this will be just the beginning of what we anticipate will be a lot of other referendums and laws that'll be passed.
I kind of have this contrary view of data centers. Sam, people have made this argument. Sam Altman expressed it on the podcast yesterday. It's like, well, if we limit the number, we're not going to have no data centers, right? Like worst came to worst, the government just built them on federal lands. Elon Musk's talking about building them in outer space. Like we're going to have data centers. And if we only have a limited number of data centers, then the compute is going to be really expensive. Who can afford to pay for that? The large corporations, right? The military. It's going to get used in the ways that we're most concerned about. and fewer are the ways that are actually beneficial. And, they talk too about UBI, right? Universal Basic Income, but also kind of making sure people have some access to kind of some advanced compute. So, maybe they can be an entrepreneur or kind of work on their own health problems. All these type of things is part of the UBI. Well, there's not going to be universal basic compute provided if compute is really limited. So I agree that obviously there are problems with the data centers. There are environmental problems with the data centers. There are problems kind of with, higher electricity consumption, especially when, it's produced with coal and, natural gas. There are these problems, but there are a lot of downsides to saying, okay, only, essentially saying only certain people are going to get it. I posted today, I was like, well, what if we tried to solve air pollution by capping the amount of electricity we could produce, right? So it got really expensive and only corporations in the military can afford it. That's not a good alternative.
You're right, but this isn't about an objective evaluation of data centers and what'll eventually happen. This is about a growing number of people, a small minority, but a growing number of people that are just anti-AI, that would like to stop AI. And that even if some of them would probably say, if it's limited to only the government and some companies having it, that means it's probably not going to disrupt my job, because not all companies will have access to it. This is not about whether or not they're on balance better in the long run for societal progress. And this is one of the reasons why, at least within political circles, we need to do a better job of having a more sophisticated discussion about this. It's not just a data centers are bad or AI is bad. There obviously needs to be discussion about how they'll be used. And there's no trust. I mean, we saw in this last slide that public trust is fracturing because there's so little commitment by any federal agency or state agency to say exactly where this is going to go, or how people will have access to it, or what the safety net is going to be. And without any of that, it's much easier and actually makes some sense to say, then we don't want any of it. And we're going to see a lot more of it because we aren't going to find that kind of commitment, other than maybe from a few of the tech companies that will start to say, we're in favor of this, but they're not going to be able to lead all of that. This has to happen on a broader scale.
Yeah.
And maybe tied to that in terms of raising awareness is, of course, the documentary that's out now called The AI Doc, or How I Became an Apocalyptimist, is a really interesting title. I have not had a chance to see this yet. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it and would love to bring this on campus, actually, too. But this is one way to help start prompting some of that discussion. Unfortunately, we need to make sure it's showing in more movie theaters. In my town, it's not showing. So hopefully other people have a chance to see it.
Yeah, and they're building all the data centers around your town. So,
maybe the data centers should sponsor a viewing of this documentary. I don't know. Now moving on to discussion about AI in healthcare and thinking about something that we were discussing before, what this means for healthcare, and not just in terms of universal healthcare, but also in terms of what AI is able to provide in terms of individual care and support.
And, it's just, it's like you'd say, talk about the negatives, but, you also talk about the positives. And there are areas, we have to go really far just to see a doctor, right? That for a lot of people, they don't have insurance. They can't maybe afford some, basic medical advice. And they're saying they did some research, right? Just looking at, there's OpenAI, what are people using ChatGPT for? And they found that a big thing is health advice. And of course, we've also seen other people, Microsoft say this, right? What's Copilot being used for? It's used for healthcare advice. So, and, same with Claude. So a little less, right? Because it's a little less consumer oriented, but, they're building all the capacities in there to, to be able to provide, they'll say, hey, this is a doctor, don't take this legitimate, but, it's really no different than asking your friend, telling them what's wrong with you, see if they have any ideas, except this is probably going to be better than that, right? So you just got to be careful about what you're acting on, but it is a positive development. And it's, it's something we don't want to restrict, right? We don't want to get in a position where we don't have any compute for healthcare solutions.
Now moving on to some discussion about vibe coding and how this is flooding the App Store, and everybody had to see this coming, right? I mean, it makes it easier and easier to be able to create your own apps. Of course, people are trying to monetize or at least share their apps in the App Store. And there's a lot of pushback and concern about what this might mean.
Yeah, it's just because there's so many apps, like 200,000 more apps, right, than there were at this kind of the same time last year. So, and there's concerns about like security, and I know there was an approval process you had to go through to be like in the App Store, and then they kind of they kind of became a little less strict about it. Now, one of the things they're doing is like trying to slow it down and by putting that strict process back in place, because a lot of the pipe coders are not going to be able to maybe even meet the process. But, it's just kind of, you are seeing, again, it's another good positive use, right? We're seeing an explosion of creativity. Like you say, in some instances, maybe people are selling the app, and and they're entrepreneurs. In other cases, they just built something that's useful and they want to share it within a community so that other people can use it, right? So positive use, but it's another thing we got to figure out how to manage.
And I love that it spawned a new job category, vibe coding cleanup specialists. We're going to see a lot more of this going forward, I think. Couple
Yeah.
more items that we want to touch on. Moving into some broader themes and kind of reflecting on all of this. Really, we can only limit access for so long. We've talked about how that's the case in the classroom. Now we need to think about what that means society-wide for business sectors, for the app store, for access to particular tools. We talk about Mythos is restricted now. Capability is gated by access controls, internal policies. Where does this go in terms of what the near future and the reckoning might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think they know that eventually, they'll probably release this, right? People know that there's other labs that may or may not release it. But even absent those labs, right, it's certainly possible for other countries, other actors to develop these capabilities, right? There's all this talk about how China, well, they built some of these models by basically kind of, stealing stealing a lot of the model weights and stuff from the U.S. companies. So, maybe that's going to happen. And even then, it's like, look, 2 years out, this is not going to be sophisticated technology, right? So even to say it takes China or Russia or Iran or North Korea, right? And there's the gambit, right? Like the U.S. relations with China are testy, but we're not in anywhere close to a conflict. We're kind of are with Russia and the Ukraine. Maybe we were with Iran. Who knows if they'll start back up again, right? Potential for conflict with North Korea, threatening. So, when you have an actor like that get these types of cyber capabilities and they can't, compete control of airspace, right? They're just going to put their efforts into other things that are really disruptive to our economy or potentially disruptive to our military with models that aren't coming out of the main labs.
So we're going to end with this: what must be done now? And there's a whole laundry list of things that should be done and actions that we should be taking. But here's some starting points, starting with rebuilding safety evaluations around peer behavior. Current red teaming frameworks are testing this in isolation. We have to really look at how this is working in the real world, testing it in multi-agent environments. What do you do about peer preservation? How do you factor in fake alignment? And when these models are misleading us, that's something we have to take very seriously and start testing it more than just an individual model versus an individual model. But even when you're talking about multi-agent models, and it's not just about even thinking about like a multi-agent harness like Cowork. On Cowork on Microsoft's platform, they're including models from Claude and Microsoft and OpenAI to be able to work against one another. But recognize that peer preservation can still exist there too, and that needs to be fully tested.
It could be a learned behavior, right? Everybody looks out for their friends, right? When push comes to shove, right? So kind of doing that. And, we talked about this before, right? Kind of emotion monitoring. It's actually a way to kind of check in on the models, for some safety issues. But really, it's probably time to get some governance frameworks. And, you can talk about that like in a really kind of general sense. So we need governance. Gary Marcus posted today, like, oh, well, maybe this Mythos stuff is a little bit hyped. I haven't really seen it. He cites one researcher who says, like, she makes some arguments as to why it's some hype. But he's like, look, regardless, like, we need to start dealing with this. We need some governance around it. And, then you say, yeah, I know another professor kind of raising, and actually saw another post about it too, even on Facebook, like, okay, is it time to nationalize the industry? Again, there were theoretical discussions about this, but, is it time? Who do you want to control this, right? Like some people say, in the Anthropic dispute, right? We talked about this before. It's like, well, okay, maybe, if you don't like the current, president, maybe you don't want the current president to have control over the AI, but who do you want to have it, like, control over it? Maybe you don't like Elon Musk. You want him to make the decisions about, like, how AI is used, or Sam Altman or Dario or Demis, right? Like, those are kind of the four leading CEOs are, isn't this what we have government for, right? Like U.S. Defense, production companies, that make jet aircraft. They don't decide how they're used in war. The government purchases those and makes their decisions. And at least we still have an elected government, so at least we have some say, even if it's modest. But also too, more people are talking about preparing for disruptions at scale. Like Sam Altman, talked about that, in a different podcast. But he's like, look, we need to prepare biodefenses. We could have a biological weapons attack. We could have the equivalent of it, right? We could have a chemical a weapons attack. We need to develop some types of systems around that. The NCFL, the National Catholic Forensic League, they released their PF and LD topics for the national tournament, and one is the LD's topic. It says something like healthcare. I think it says healthcare should be treated as a public good. I was like, yes, it should, because we're going to need a strong public health infrastructure. One, to defend and ameliorate, I guess I should say, right, the impacts of a biological attack. But two, for these portability arguments, right, that I was just talking about, that you can pull right out of the paper. So that OpenAI released, and and other people have been making in other ways. So there's going to be, we can't solve all the problems by kind of not having AI, right? We can't solve all the problems by just saying, well, AI is going to solve the AI problems, or can be, obviously cyber defense, AI cyber defenses, it can be directed against the cyber offenses. But we also need to develop societal resilience, right? So we're prepared if there is some type of biological or chemical weapons attack, if parts of the grid goes down because there's a cyber attack, right? Like we're kind of, especially as Americans, we're used to kind of being separated by the oceans, right? So the war never made it onto the soil, right? But imagine living in Israel or Iran right now. We need to start building up that type of kind of resilient infrastructure in the United States.
So you have your marching orders. Start thinking about societal resilience, and we'll be back next week to talk about our own efforts and to think about what's coming next. It's astonishing when I think about even the fight between the Department of War and Anthropic, and that seems like it was ages ago, and it was just weeks ago. There's so much that's changing, and it's only going to speed up. Thanks for this, Stefan.
I would just say one thing at the end. This is AX higher ed. They're like, oh, you guys are going into all these safety things and everything, and societal changes. But this is what people should be talking about in class, especially political science classes, philosophy classes. You're in the communication department, and students are doing public speaking, and maybe they're having some debates in an argument class. This is their life. This is their future, right? There's some problems that are going to happen. Hopefully, some good things with healthcare and education. But these are great things that just bring them to life in class.
Great. Thanks, Stefan.
Yep.